When you hear the word Spartan, one image usually comes to mind. Bronze helmets glinting under the sun, rippling warriors marching in unison, unbreakable discipline, and the immortal cry of, "This is Sparta," thanks to Hollywood epics like 300. The Spartans have long been celebrated as the ultimate warrior society, revered for their bravery, their endurance, and their strict military code. But what if I told you that behind this polished myth lies something far darker? Practices so disturbing, so unsettling, that ancient writers hinted at them in whispers, and later historians often chose to bury them entirely. The truth is that the Spartans weren't just masters of war, they were masters of control, and control in their society extended into the most intimate, private, and taboo areas of life, areas that would horrify us today. To create a society of perfect soldiers, Sparta engineered not only the bodies of its citizens, but also their relationships, their sexuality, and even their marriages. And the practices they enforced make the brutal military drills of the agōgē look tame in comparison. From the moment a Spartan boy was taken from his family at age 7 and thrown into the state-run training system, his entire existence was controlled. His food, his sleep, his punishments, and yes, even his sexual life. The Spartans believed that physical endurance alone was not enough. To forge unbreakable warriors, they created intimate bonding practices between older men and boys, relationships that went far beyond mentorship. To the outside world, these bonds were justified as a way to strengthen loyalty in battle. But the reality was far darker: systematic sexual initiation that blurred the line between education and exploitation. And it wasn't optional. It was a matter of state policy. And when these boys grew older, the disturbing practices didn't stop. Marriage in Sparta was unlike anywhere else in Greece. Spartan wedding rituals involved secrecy, violence, and humiliation. A bride's head might be shaved, she would be dressed as a boy, and the groom would abduct her under cover of night. Even the consummation was not left to the couple. It followed bizarre customs that reinforced control rather than intimacy. To the Spartans, marriage was not about love. It was about breeding strong offspring for the state. What's even more chilling is how Spartan women were drawn into this system. They were trained, inspected, and pressured to reproduce with the strongest men, sometimes even outside their marriages, because the state's survival depended on creating the next generation of perfect warriors. Sex was not a personal act in Sparta. It was a tool of power, manipulation, and social engineering. And this is just the beginning, because when Sparta conquered new territories, their disturbing practices expanded outward. Captured women, defeated warriors, and even the children of their enemies were dragged into systems of control and rituals that we would find unthinkable today. In fact, some of these customs were so extreme that later historians, embarrassed or horrified, either glossed over them or left them out entirely. So, forget the myth of the noble Spartan. Over the next parts, we'll peel back the layers of legend and reveal the intimate, unsettling truth about the Spartan world. A truth built on disturbing sexual practices, ruthless control, and state-sanctioned exploitation. If you thought the battlefield was the most terrifying place in Sparta, you're about to find out that the real horrors often began in the bedroom. When a Spartan boy turned just 7 years old, his childhood effectively ended. He was taken from the arms of his mother and placed into the agōgē, a state-run institution that stripped away family bonds and replaced them with something far more sinister: loyalty to the Spartan state, forged through cruelty, deprivation, and practices that would horrify modern readers. The agōgē was not a school in any sense we would recognize today. It was an environment designed to break children down psychologically while hardening their bodies into weapons. Boys were forced to live in communal barracks, separated from their families, where they endured hunger, freezing nights without blankets, and relentless physical training. Stealing food wasn't just allowed, it was expected. But if caught, the boy was savagely beaten, not for stealing, but for failing to succeed. The lesson was clear: cunning mattered as much as strength. Yet what makes the agōgē most disturbing is not the physical hardship, but the emotional and social conditioning it imposed. The system encouraged intimate bonds between younger boys and older youths or adult men, Officially, these relationships were framed as mentorships, meant to instill discipline, courage, and obedience. But ancient sources such as Plutarch and Xenophon hint at dimensions of these bonds that were far more personal, far more unsettling. Spartan society believed these relationships would mold boys into warriors utterly loyal to their comrades. Affection was twisted into a tool of state control. A boy was taught to revere his older partner, to seek his approval, and to endure punishments without complaint. The emotional closeness, according to some accounts, could be as intense as any family bond, only deliberately engineered, manipulated, and weaponized. To understand just how radical this was, imagine an entire culture where children were conditioned to place the state above their parents, where natural innocence was deliberately reshaped into loyalty through orchestrated attachment. The Spartans weren't just training soldiers, they were reshaping human beings from the inside out, using methods that today might be seen as psychological manipulation on a massive scale. And this was only the beginning. As the boys grew older, the initiation rituals grew darker. The agōgē demanded not only endurance and obedience, but submission to practices that blurred the line between mentorship and exploitation, discipline and cruelty. These rites were not written in official laws, but passed down through tradition, practices so shocking that later Greek writers accused Sparta of corrupting its own youth. By the time a Spartan boy reached his teenage years, he was no longer a child in any recognizable sense. He had become a product of the system, hungry, hardened, and bound by attachments carefully cultivated to serve the military state. But the most disturbing part was yet to come, when these teenagers were thrust into brutal survival rites and secret initiations that would test their humanity itself. If the agōgē molded Spartan boys into hardened youths, the Sparta revealed the chilling purpose of all that training. It was the final initiation, the moment when teenagers were transformed into instruments of state-sanctioned terror. Ancient sources disagree on the exact details, but the broad outlines remain clear and horrifying. At around 18 years old, the strongest and most promising youths were chosen for a secret mission. By day, they seemed like any other young men in training, but by night they were loosed upon the countryside with only a dagger, sometimes barefoot, sometimes even without food. Their task: to terrorize and kill the helots, the enslaved population that formed the backbone of Spartan society. Helots outnumbered Spartans by as many as 7 to 1. They farmed the land, provided the food, and sustained the Spartan way of life. But they also lived under constant surveillance and brutal oppression. The Sparta was Sparta's answer to this imbalance, an annual ritual of intimidation designed to remind the helots of their place. According to some accounts, the ephors, the highest officials in Sparta, would declare war on the helot population each year. This gave young Spartans free rein to kill without breaking religious laws, since officially it wasn't murder. The chosen youths would stalk through the darkness, watching, listening, striking when least expected. They were encouraged to target the strongest and most capable helots, anyone who might become a leader or resist Spartan control. Imagine the fear this spread, the knowledge that every year young Spartans were prowling the night, armed with knives, seeking victims. This was more than a test of stealth and courage. It was psychological conditioning on a terrifying scale. By forcing its youth to commit acts of violence against the enslaved, the Spartan state ensured that loyalty ran deep and that compassion was replaced by cruelty. The Sparta was designed not only to terrorize the helots, but also to harden the young Spartans into killers who could carry out orders without hesitation. Plutarch describes it bluntly: these young men wandered through the fields and slew any helots they caught. Other accounts suggest it was also a survival exercise, boys living off stolen food, hiding in the wild, learning to move like shadows. Whatever the exact details, the underlying truth is the same. The Sparta was a program of systematic violence, masquerading as military training. What makes this ritual even more disturbing is how normalized it was. For the Spartans, it wasn't a crime or even a shameful act. It was a civic duty, woven into the very fabric of society. The Sparta blurred the line between soldier and executioner, between discipline and atrocity. And it did so while the rest of Greece looked on in fascination, sometimes horrified. sometimes envious of Sparta's ruthless efficiency. For the young Spartans, surviving the Brutality was a badge of honor, proof that they could endure hunger, fear, and moral compromise. For the helots, it was a reminder that their oppressors ruled not just through laws but through the constant threat of hidden knives in the dark. By the time a Spartan youth completed this phase, he was no longer simply a trainee. He had been baptized in terror, both as its wielder and as a tool of the state. The agōgē and the Brutality together ensured that by adulthood, every Spartan warrior was not just a fighter, but a living embodiment of the system's cold, unyielding logic. But this was not the end of Sparta's disturbing traditions, because even as the young warriors proved themselves through the Brutality, the state still demanded further rituals, festivals where violence was sanctified, where blood was spilled in the name of religion, and where cruelty was disguised as piety. If the Brutality was the shadowy knife in the dark, the Spartan religious festivals were the blazing torch in the open square. These events stripped away secrecy and placed cruelty on full display, transforming violence into a sacred offering. For Spartans, suffering was not a byproduct of training, it was a public act of devotion. The most infamous of these festivals centered around the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia, a goddess tied to fertility, hunting, and, disturbingly, the endurance of pain. Each year, Spartan boys were brought before the altar in what might seem like a religious celebration. But instead of hymns and prayers, what awaited them was the lash. According to ancient witnesses, young boys were whipped mercilessly, sometimes until their flesh tore, sometimes until they collapsed. The goal was not to break them, but to test how much agony they could withstand while maintaining composure. Onlookers cheered not for mercy, but for endurance. The boy who could suffer longest without crying out won glory, not just for himself, but for his family. It wasn't always survivable. There are chilling accounts of boys whipped to the point of death, their bodies crumpling at the goddess's altar, their blood soaking the ground as part of the ritual. For the Spartans, this was not a tragedy, it was a sacrifice. Death itself could be interpreted as the ultimate offering to Artemis, a sign that the boy had pushed his body beyond mortal limits. And this was no hidden cruelty. It was a spectacle witnessed by crowds that included foreign visitors. Plutarch tells us that Roman tourists later flocked to Sparta specifically to watch these gruesome ceremonies, as if they were theater. Imagine an entire city gathered, not to celebrate a victory or a harvest, but to revel in the sight of children enduring torment for the gods. But Artemis Orthia was not the only context where ritualized pain dominated Spartan life. Another brutal practice was the diamastigosis, a contest of endurance where older youths competed to see who could withstand the harshest whippings. This wasn't just about physical resilience, it was a demonstration of obedience to authority, a reminder that Spartan bodies belonged not to themselves but to the state and the gods. For the Spartans, these ceremonies blurred the line between religion and politics. They reinforced the idea that every aspect of life, from childhood games to state festivals, was training for war. By enduring lashes before Artemis, boys proved that they could endure wounds on the battlefield. By bleeding at the altar, they offered their flesh not just to a deity, but to the state itself. It is difficult for us today to imagine faith expressed through pain so deliberately, so publicly, but for Sparta this was normal. To reject it would have been to reject not just a ritual, but the very foundation of Spartan identity. And yet, beneath the surface of these sanctioned ceremonies lurked something even darker. Because the Spartans did not just demand suffering from their own children, they also turned cruelty outward onto their enemies, their slaves, and anyone who defied them. To truly understand the depths of Spartan brutality, we must look not only at the rituals of pain, but at the way they treated those beneath them. This takes us to the next chapter, the systematic dehumanization of the helots, the enslaved class who lived under perpetual fear of massacre, humiliation, and violence. Every great Spartan warrior, every gleaming shield in formation, every banquet in the Syssitia, all of it was built on the broken backs of the helots. These enslaved peoples, mostly of Messenian origin, vastly outnumbered their Spartan masters. Historians estimate there may have been 7 helots for every one Spartan citizen, and yet, this massive population did not revolt constantly. Why? Because the Spartans maintained control through an unrelenting system of fear, humiliation, and ritualized violence. From birth, helots were reminded that their lives were worth less than nothing to the state. Unlike chattel slaves elsewhere in Greece, helots were bound to the land, forced to farm the estates of their Spartan masters. But even here their labor was not secure. Crops could be seized, families torn apart, and punishments delivered at the whim of any Spartan. The most chilling element of their subjugation was the annual declaration of war. Each year, as a matter of ritual, the Spartan ephors formally announced war on the helots. This legal fiction meant that killing a helot was not considered murder, but an act of sanctioned warfare. It transformed daily oppression into a sacred duty, giving young Spartans free license to slaughter. This practice was most evident in the notorious Cryptia, a state-organized terror campaign masquerading as training. Young Spartan men, freshly graduated from the agōgē, were sent into the countryside under cover of darkness. Their mission was not simply to survive, but to hunt. They targeted the strongest and most capable helots, the ones most likely to lead uprisings. Without warning, helots might be ambushed in the fields, stabbed in their huts, or simply made to disappear. It was less a secret police operation than a ritualized culling of the enslaved. But even outside of these sanctioned killings, daily life for helots was steeped in humiliation. Plutarch records that they were often forced to drink wine until they staggered and then paraded before Spartan youths. The purpose? To serve as living cautionary tales of drunkenness and loss of self-control, vices a Spartan warrior was never to indulge. Imagine being compelled to degrade yourself in public, not for your own shame, but to reinforce the pride of your oppressors. Helots were also sometimes made to wear ridiculous clothing, dogskin caps or sheepskin garments, to mark them out as inferior. Their humiliation was not random, it was systematic, a psychological campaign designed to remind them every day that they were less than human. And yet, despite this constant subjugation, the helots were indispensable. They grew the food that sustained Spartan warriors, freeing citizens to train, fight, and dominate. Without the helots, there would have been no Sparta. The irony is stark. The same people the Spartans despised and terrorized were the very ones who kept their society alive. But even this brutal system was not foolproof. There were uprisings, moments when the helots dared to resist. And when they did, Sparta responded with overwhelming vengeance. Executions, massacres, and punishments so severe they echo through history as some of the darkest chapters of ancient Greece. To understand just how far Sparta would go to crush defiance, we must now look at these helot revolts and the savage reprisals that followed. For centuries, Sparta's stability rested on a paradox, a warrior elite so disciplined and feared that its neighbors quaked before them, yet so small in number that it was forever haunted by the shadow of the enslaved multitudes it oppressed. And sometimes that shadow rose up. The most famous of these uprisings were the Messenian revolts, eruptions of fury from a people crushed for generations under Spartan boots. The helots of Messenia had been subjugated since the 8th century BCE, when Sparta conquered their fertile lands. For them, bondage was not the fate of a conquered army or a debt owed to a master. It was hereditary. Born into slavery, they tilled fields they no longer owned, producing grain they were not allowed to eat. Over time, their desperation hardened into defiance. One of the earliest revolts, the First Messenian War, nearly shattered Spartan control. The helots, united under leaders like Aristodemus, fought with such ferocity that the war lasted 2 decades. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the enslaved could break their chains. But Sparta's iron discipline and military reforms eventually triumphed, plunging the Messenians back into servitude. But the helots never forgot. Their resistance smoldered beneath the surface, waiting for a chance. That chance came after a disaster from the heavens, the great earthquake of 464 BCE. Sparta's temples crumbled, houses collapsed, and hundreds of citizens were killed. To the helots, it must have seemed like divine justice, the gods themselves striking at their oppressors. And they seized the opportunity. In Messenia and Laconia, helots rose in revolt, fortifying themselves on Mount Itum, a natural stronghold. The rebellion lasted nearly a decade, These were not scattered uprisings, but a sustained war, with the helots determined to win back their freedom. For a moment, Sparta itself seemed vulnerable, its might shaken to the core, but the Spartans were nothing if not relentless. They laid siege to Ithome, year after year, grinding down the helots' resistance. Plutarch describes the fear this revolt instilled in the Spartans, the realization that their society balanced precariously on the edge of annihilation. Eventually, with aid from allies and much blood spilled, Sparta crushed the rebellion. Many of the surviving helots were expelled or massacred, a grim reminder that mercy had no place in Spartan statecraft. And this was the pattern of every helot revolt. Resistance answered with annihilation. Sparta could not afford leniency. Each uprising was treated as an existential threat, because in truth it was. Had the helots succeeded, Sparta would have collapsed, its fearsome warrior caste obliterated. The repercussions of these rebellions shaped Spartan policy for centuries. The annual declaration of war, the Krypteias murders, the ritual humiliations, all were sharpened in the wake of uprisings. The Spartans lived in perpetual paranoia, their society a fortress built on shifting sands. But these rebellions also exposed the hypocrisy of Sparta's so-called ideal. To outsiders, Spartan life looked like a model of discipline, unity, and martial virtue. But at its heart was a terror state, one that maintained its glory only through the endless suffering of those it enslaved. And the cruelty did not stop at keeping the helots in line. The same society that prided itself on order and control turned its harsh gaze inward, on its women, its warriors, and even its kings. The darker side of Spartan sexuality, the rituals of dominance, and the perverse customs that shocked even their Greek neighbors reveal a people who believed cruelty was not just necessary, but sacred. When most people imagine Sparta, they picture warriors in crimson cloaks, bronze shields flashing beneath the sun at Thermopylae. But beneath that shining image of military glory lay customs so shocking that even other Greeks whispered about them. The Spartans believed the body was not just a vessel for war, it was a tool for power, control, and sometimes humiliation. Unlike much of Greece, Sparta granted its women a strange paradox of freedom. Spartan women could own land, inherit wealth, and speak boldly in public. Ancient writers like Aristotle sneered that Spartan wives were scandalously outspoken. They trained their bodies, racing and wrestling in public, something that would have horrified Athenians, who kept their women cloistered in silence. But this freedom came at a cost. Women were ultimately treated as vessels for producing stronger warriors. Marriage itself was twisted by ritual. A Spartan wedding was not a celebration but an ordeal. The bride's head was shaved, she was dressed in men's clothing, and she waited in a dark room. The groom would slip in secretly, often after dining in the communal mess hall with his fellow soldiers, and the marriage was consummated in hushed secrecy. Some scholars argue this bizarre ritual symbolized the conquest of the woman, a reenactment of dominance and submission. Others suggest it blurred gender lines, creating a strange initiation where desire was tied to strangeness and control. But even within marriage, loyalty was not demanded in the way we might expect. Spartan husbands could allow their wives to bear children with other men, even strangers, if it was believed they would produce stronger offspring. Plutarch records that the law of Lycurgus encouraged such arrangements, prioritizing the health of the state over the sanctity of the family. Imagine the psychological toll of such a society, where intimacy itself was stripped of love and reduced to duty, where personal bonds were subordinated to the cold needs of the state. And then there was the matter of male relationships. The agōgē, Sparta's brutal education system, didn't just train boys in warfare. It fostered bonds that were often physical as well as emotional. Older men were encouraged to form mentorships with youths, relationships that blurred into the sexual. The state saw this as a way to deepen loyalty. Soldiers who had shared such intimacy would fight to the death for one another. To outsiders, it was shocking, even scandalous, but to Sparta, it was another weapon in the arsenal of control. These practices weren't merely tolerated, they were ritualized. Intimacy became a tool of discipline, dominance, and sometimes humiliation. A Spartan warrior's body was not his own. It belonged to the state. His desires, his family, his children, even his most private moments were folded into the machinery of control. And this blending of cruelty and intimacy extended to women too. Though Spartan women held more freedom than their Athenian sisters, their lives were defined by pressure. If they failed to produce healthy sons, they could be shamed, ridiculed, or cast aside. Their worth was measured not in beauty or character, but in their ability to birth warriors who could endure the agōgē. This is why Sparta's legacy is so chilling. It wasn't just a militarized society. It was a society where even love, sex, and family became weapons of the state. Pleasure was twisted into duty, intimacy into dominance, and freedom into another form of servitude. And as shocking as these customs are, they were not the end of Spartan cruelty, because the Spartans saved their most grotesque rituals for moments of ultimate control, not in the bedroom, not in the training fields, but in the punishments reserved for those who dared to betray their city. For all their obsession with discipline and control, the Spartans were not a people who forgave weakness. Every aspect of their society was geared towards strength, endurance, and loyalty to the state, and those who failed to measure up paid a terrible price. Take the helots, the enslaved population that vastly outnumbered their Spartan masters. The Spartans lived in constant fear of revolt, and their solution was as shocking as it was brutal: ritual murder. Each year when the Spartan ephors, the city's magistrates, declared war on the helots, it gave citizens legal cover to slaughter them without consequence. Young Spartan men, newly hardened by the agōgē, would creep into the night, hunting down helots in secret assassinations. This state-sanctioned terror was not just about control. It was about instilling fear so deep that rebellion seemed impossible. Punishments for betrayal or cowardice were equally severe. Spartans who fled in battle faced a fate arguably worse than death. They were stripped of all honor, forced to wear cloaks with colored patches, a visible mark of shame in a culture obsessed with conformity. They were ridiculed, humiliated, and excluded from public life. In a society where reputation was everything, such disgrace was soul-crushing, a slow social death that lingered far longer than a spear wound. And then there were the grotesque executions. Spartan discipline was so unforgiving that even their own soldiers could be slaughtered for disobedience. Ancient sources tell us deserters or conspirators might be whipped until their flesh tore apart, beaten publicly before their comrades, or executed with calculated humiliation. To the Spartans, punishment was not just about killing the body. It was about destroying the will, making an example so horrifying that no one dared repeat the crime. Even children were not spared from this cruelty. At birth, newborns were inspected by the elders. If the child appeared weak, deformed, or unfit for the warrior's path, they were abandoned, left to die on the slopes of Mount Taygetus. To outsiders, this was infanticide. To Spartans, it was purification, a way to ensure the state was never weakened by frailty. Imagine the chilling silence of those mountainsides, littered with the bones of discarded infants, a sacrifice to the god of war, made by a society that valued strength above all else. But the punishments didn't stop at physical torment. The Spartans also weaponized fear. Stories circulated of helots being forced to drink themselves into a stupor, then paraded before Spartan youths as cautionary examples of weakness and shame. In this way, punishment was transformed into spectacle, cruelty wrapped in lesson, a grim performance of dominance that reinforced the state's iron grip. And yet, for all their terror, the Spartans themselves could not escape the collapse of their way of life. Their society, so ruthlessly constructed, eventually rotted from within. When Sparta finally fell to outside powers, it was not with the defiance of Leonidas at Thermopylae, but with the quiet decay of a people who had sacrificed too much of their humanity on the altar of discipline. The world remembers the Spartans as warriors, heroes of the ancient battlefield. But beneath the bronze helmets and crimson cloaks lies a darker truth, a society built on cruelty, a people who turned family, intimacy, and even life itself into tools of control. Their legacy is not just one of military valor, but of terror, shame, and blood. And perhaps that is the most haunting lesson of all. The Spartans taught us that strength without mercy is not true strength. It is fear. It is control. It is a legacy that echoes across the centuries, a warning carved in blood on the stones of history.